The man who would one day be known to the world as Pol Pot was born into a quiet village, nestled along the Sen River, in northeastern Cambodia. The place was Prex Baoth, a small fishing settlement with little to distinguish it from the many hundreds that dotted the Cambodian landscape in the 1920s. Yet, from this tranquil setting emerged one of the most brutal and enigmatic figures of the 20th century. Official records list his birth date as the 25th of May 1928. However, some accounts suggest he may have been born 3 years earlier, in 1925. The lack of clarity is emblematic of a life shrouded in secrecy and contradiction. Given the known timeline of his early education, the 1928 date appears more likely. Born as Seloth Sar, he was the 8th of 9 children. His family was among the more affluent in the region. His father, Seloth Phim, was a landowner of mixed Khmer and Chinese descent, possessing over 20 acres of rice paddies and a herd of cattle, a substantial holding by rural Cambodian standards. His mother, Sok Nem, was a deeply devout Buddhist, and much of Sar's early upbringing took place within a household that balanced traditional Cambodian values with moderate wealth and privilege. In 1934, when Seloth Sar was still a boy, he was sent to Phnom Penh to become a novice monk at Wat Batum Va Day. The capital's Buddhist monastery offered more than spiritual instruction. It imposed a strict discipline and routine that would leave a lasting impression on the young novice. But this spiritual life would be short-lived. Soon after, in 1935, he transferred to a Roman Catholic primary school in Phnom Penh. This was a colonial institution, and here Seloth Sar studied alongside the children of the French elite. He did not excel academically. In fact, he showed little interest in his studies, preferring sports and games over the classroom. It took him until 1941 to complete his primary education, 2 years behind schedule. Nevertheless, family connections and privilege paved the way for his continued advancement. In 1942, he was accepted into a prestigious new boarding school for gifted students, one established under the patronage of the Cambodian royal family. He studied there until 1947, again devoting more time to football and basketball than books. But while his own focus remained scattered, the world around him was shifting. The 1940s had brought great turmoil to Southeast Asia. In October 1940, the Kingdom of Thailand invaded Cambodia and Laos, seeking to take advantage of France's weakened position due to the Second World War. Then, in April 1941, King Mani Vong of Cambodia died. The French colonial administration bypassed his designated successor and placed a young 18-year-old Norodom Sihanouk on the throne, assuming he would be pliable and cooperative. That assumption would prove misguided in the years ahead. Later that same year, Japanese forces invaded Cambodia as part of their broader campaign across the Pacific. For 4 years, Cambodia endured Japanese occupation, while Sihanouk sought to assert more independence, declaring the Kingdom of Kampuchea briefly, and though French control was swiftly reimposed after Japan's defeat, the moment had planted seeds of nationalist aspiration. Meanwhile, back in Phnom Penh, Seloth Sar had failed to obtain the necessary qualifications to pursue a traditional academic path. Instead, he enrolled in a carpentry course at a technical college. For the son of a wealthy landowner, this seemed an unusual step, but fortune or family influence favored him once more. In 1949, despite his poor academic record, Sar was awarded a coveted scholarship to study in Paris. This decision would change the course of his life and the future of Cambodia. In France, Seloth Sar was exposed to an entirely new world. He enrolled in an engineering program, but once again he struggled academically and eventually failed his exam. But more significantly, he became involved in a growing political movement among Cambodian students living in Paris. Here, Sar joined the Khmer Student Association, a moderate group advocating for Cambodian autonomy, and later more radical cells such as the clandestine Circle Marx. These groups operated in secrecy, holding underground meetings to study the writings of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. Yet even in these circles, Sar's understanding of Marxist theory remained superficial. He later admitted that he did not fully grasp the works of Karl Marx. What captivated him was not ideology, but the allure of revolution, especially revolution achieved through force. While he walked along the Seine and attended political meetings in Paris, back in Southeast Asia, events were unfolding that would shape the future of his homeland. In 1946, the First Indo-China War erupted in Vietnam, as Vietnamese nationalists fought to expel the French colonial administration. Cambodia too was in flux. In 1946, Cambodia held its first parliamentary elections. In 1947, a modern constitution was adopted. By the early 1950s, King Sihanouk had begun pressing the French for full independence. But unrest and political agitation persisted, and civil society fractured under the weight of competing ideology. In 1952, amid this political chaos, the Marxist student network in Paris decided to send Saloth Sar back to Cambodia as their liaison. His task was to assess the political climate and explore opportunities for revolutionary action. He left France and returned to Cambodia at the end of. He arrived in time to witness Sihanouk's dramatic push for independence. In the summer of 1953, the king demanded full autonomy from France. Facing mounting pressure in Vietnam and a weakening grip over its colonies, the French government acquiesced. On the 9th of November 1953, Cambodia gained its independence. After nearly a century as a protectorate, the Kingdom of Cambodia stood alone once more. But peace would not follow. As Saloth Sar returned to his homeland, the foundations of the modern Cambodian state were still unformed. Political factions were emerging. The monarchy retained power, but new parties were rising in opposition. Meanwhile, armed insurgencies in neighboring Vietnam spilled over Cambodia's borders, sowing the seeds of future conflict. The man who would become Pol Pot had returned home. The years ahead would shape him into a revolutionary, a commander, and ultimately the architect of one of the 20th century's most devastating regimes. The Jungle Years and the Rise of the Khmer Rouge 1953-1968. Following Cambodia's declaration of independence in November 1953, Saloth Sar, the man later known as Pol Pot, returned to a country filled with uncertainty. Though independence had been achieved, the shape and direction of Cambodia's future remained deeply contested. The monarchy under King Norodom Sihanouk remained in power. Yet beneath the surface, factions of various ideologies, some moderate and others revolutionary, were beginning to form and gather strength. For the next 15 years, Saloth Sar's life would transition from the city to the forest, from the peripheries of political activism to the heart of an armed revolutionary movement. This would become the formative period of his rise. In the years immediately following independence, Cambodia attempted to shape a functioning democratic system. A new constitution had already been adopted in 1947, and elections were held in but these were dominated by the political strategy of Sihanouk. Just before the 1955 elections, King Sihanouk abdicated the throne in favor of his father and established a new political party, Sang Kom Restauranium, or the Community of the Common People. Through intimidation, manipulation, and outright electoral fraud, Sihanouk's party won more than 80% of the vote. Cambodia now found itself under a new form of authoritarian control, one that wore the outward appearance of democracy, but which allowed for little dissent. During this time, Saloth Sar lived a largely inconspicuous life in Phnom Penh. He secured a teaching job at a private school, instructing students in literature, geography, and history. In 1956, he married Kieu Ponari, a woman from a well-connected Cambodian family who had studied in Paris. For a time, his life followed a modest pattern, working as a teacher by day, attending political meetings by night. But while his public life appeared conventional, Sar remained connected to underground revolutionary network. Along with a small cadre of Marxist-Leninist activists, he quietly reorganized the remnants of the Cambodian communist movement, which had largely been pushed underground by Sihanouk's repressive measures. The group began meeting in secret to discuss strategy, ideology, and the future of Cambodia. In September 1960, at a small room within Phnom Penh's railway station, 21 members of the Cambodian Marxist underground convened. The meeting was historic. From it emerged the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, an early predecessor of the Khmer Rouge. It was decided that Tu Samuth, a respected figure within the movement, would serve as the party's general secretary. Salath Sar, though less prominent at the time, was elected to the Central Committee and took on an increasingly important role. Events would move swiftly. Just 2 years later, in July 1962, Tu Samuth was killed. Officially, it was claimed that he had been murdered by Sihanouk's security forces. With his death, Sar, now known increasingly by his nom de guerre, Pol Pot, was elected to succeed him as General Secretary of the party. As pressure on leftist elements in Phnom Penh increased, Pol Pot and his colleagues fled the capital. They took refuge in the forests and mountains along the Cambodia-Vietnam border. Here they were sheltered by North Vietnamese forces, the Viet Cong, who were themselves engaged in a war of attrition against American-backed forces in South Vietnam. In the safety of these encampments, the Cambodian communists began to rebuild. From 1963 onward, the jungles became both home and headquarters. It was here that Pol Pot's persona was solidified: quiet, austere, disciplined, and elusive. He projected an image of calm leadership, though beneath it he was growing increasingly secretive and rigid. These years in the jungle would deeply shape the Khmer Rouge's structure, its ideology, and its plans for the future. During this time, the ideological foundation of Pol Pot's future regime began to emerge. While Marxist-Leninist ideology provided the foundation, Pol Pot's vision diverged significantly from classical communism. Traditional Marxist thought emphasized an urban proletariat revolution, led by industrial workers. Cambodia, by contrast, was overwhelmingly rural. Pol Pot believed that Cambodia's revolution must be led by the peasantry. Thus began the development of a uniquely Cambodian model of revolution, one that idealized the countryside and viewed urban society as corrupt and impure. This vision would form the basis of the Khmer Rouge's radical policies a decade later. Throughout the mid-1960s, the Cambodian communist movement grew slowly but steadily. The Vietnamese provided limited military aid and training, and in return Pol Pot's forces allowed the Viet Cong to use Cambodian territory to move arms and personnel. Meanwhile, Pol Pot focused on recruiting, training, and indoctrinating new members. Villagers living in remote areas were drawn into the movement, many out of opposition to Sihanouk's government, others seeking protection or opportunity. By 1966, the Workers' Party of Kampuchea was renamed the Communist Party of Kampuchea, although as before its existence remained secret. It was Sihanouk himself who gave them a name that would come to define them in history: the Khmer Rouge, or Red Cambodians. Though initially meant as a derogatory term, the name stuck. By early 1967, the Khmer Rouge began implementing a plan of armed rebellion. Their first major action came in April, in the Somlat region of Battambang province. Government officials had seized land from villagers and imposed heavy rice quotas. In response, local peasants, supported by the Khmer Rouge, rose up in protest. The uprising was swiftly crushed by the army, but it marked a significant turning point. Pol Pot's movement was no longer theoretical. It was now an armed insurgency. The government's response was harsh. In retaliation for the Somlat uprising, the army launched a brutal campaign across western Cambodia, arresting and executing suspected rebels. Far from weakening the Khmer Rouge, these actions pushed more disaffected Cambodians into the forests, into the arms of Pol Pot. Over the next 12 months, the Khmer Rouge expanded their territorial control. In the northeast, near the borders of Laos and Vietnam, entire districts came under their administration. Pol Pot's strategy was slow and calculated: consolidate territory, train new fighters, build alliances with local populations. By 1968, the Khmer Rouge numbered several thousand armed insurgents, supported by a broader network of civilian administrators and sympathizers. That same year, Pol Pot officially announced the beginning of a People's Revolutionary War. The conflict that followed would later be known as the Cambodian Civil War. But unlike many civil wars sparked by a singular dramatic event, this one crept forward quietly, in stages its early movements, seen only by those who lived in the jungles and villages of Cambodia's hidden corners. By 1968, the stage was Pol Pot had built a dedicated, disciplined revolutionary force with a clear goal to overthrow the Cambodian government and reshape the country into a society of radical agrarian equality. But the journey to power would not be straightforward. The years ahead would bring war, foreign intervention and shifting alliances. And as the 1970s approached, Cambodia's fate along with the lives of millions would hang in the balance. Civil war and seizing power, the fall of Phnom Penh 1968, 1975. By early 1968, Cambodia stood on the precipice of conflict. For years Salah Sar, now known almost exclusively by his revolutionary pseudonym Pol Pot, had been leading a slow-burning insurgency from the depths of the jungle. His Khmer Rouge forces, once numbering in the hundreds, had grown to several thousand. Operating in secrecy, they had built alliances with rural populations and quietly expanded their territory in Cambodia's northeast. But 1968 marked the official beginning of open war. In January of that year, Pol Pot and the Communist Party of Kampuchea issued the command for armed insurrection. The first target was an army base at Bay Damran in Battambang province. The attack marked the opening shot of what would become a brutal years-long conflict, the Cambodian Civil War. The Khmer Rouge's goal was straightforward: to overthrow the government in Phnom Penh, dismantle Cambodia's existing social order, and construct a radically new agrarian society, built on self-reliance and total ideological conformity. The government's reaction was immediate and harsh. Under orders from Prince Norodom Sihanouk, the Cambodian army responded with overwhelming force. Government aircraft bombed suspected rebel areas in the northeast. Villages were burned, homes destroyed, and thousands of civilians were displaced. These actions, meant to weaken the insurgency, had the opposite effect. As entire communities were uprooted, many rural Cambodians turned to the Khmer Rouge for protection, swelling the movement's ranks. By 1969, the situation had escalated far beyond what either side had expected. In March 1969, the conflict took a dramatic international turn. Under the orders of U.S. President Richard Nixon, a secret bombing campaign, Operation Menu, was launched against Cambodian territory. The objective was to destroy Viet Cong sanctuaries along the Cambodia-Vietnam border. But the bombings, which lasted into 1970, affected far more than North Vietnamese targets. Entire Cambodian villages were caught in the blasts. The devastation was immense. Between 1969 and 1973, hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs were dropped on Cambodia. An estimated 100,000 Cambodian civilians died. Once again, rural communities bore the brunt of the suffering, and once again many turned to the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's movement was no longer isolated. It was now expanding rapidly, its numbers bolstered by anger, displacement, and the consequences of foreign intervention. In March 1970, Cambodia experienced a seismic political shift. While Sihanouk was visiting Moscow and Beijing, his Prime Minister General Lon Nol launched a coup and removed him from power. Cambodia was declared a republic, the monarchy was abolished, and a new government backed by the United States was established under the Khmer Republic. This event transformed the Civil War. Now the Khmer Rouge had a powerful political ally in exile. From Beijing, Sihanouk, still revered by many Cambodians, formed an alliance with Pol Pot. Though their ideologies were vastly different, they shared a common goal: to remove Lon Nol and reclaim Cambodia. The result was a dramatic increase in support for the Khmer Rouge. Thousands who remained loyal to Sihanouk joined the insurgents. In effect, Sihanouk's prestige became the Khmer Rouge's recruitment tool. By 1972, Pol Pot was commanding an insurgent army of nearly 50,000 fighters. His hold on the revolutionary movement was absolute. As his authority grew, the inner circle of the Khmer Rouge leadership developed as well. Figures such as Nuon Shia, Ying Sari, and Khieu Samphan rose to prominence. The revolution was no longer just a guerrilla movement. It had become a parallel government. In the territories they controlled, especially in the east and northeast,
Khmer Rouge cadre enforced strict discipline, oversaw agricultural collectivization, and practiced ideological indoctrination. These experiments would later become national policy under Pol Pot's rule. Throughout the early 1970s, Cambodia's rural landscape became increasingly defined by war. As the Khmer Rouge advanced westward, Lon Nol's army struggled to contain them. The government controlled Phnom Penh and a few provincial capitals. The countryside, however, was slipping away. The American bombing campaign intensified. Between 1970 and 1973, the U.S. dropped more than 250,000 tons of bombs on eastern Cambodia. Entire regions were leveled. Schools, temples, and villages were reduced to rubble. The population of Phnom Penh swelled dramatically. Refugees poured in from the countryside. By 1975, the city's population had tripled, with over 2 million people crammed into a capital built for less than a third of that number. As U.S. forces began withdrawing from Southeast Asia, the Khmer Rouge moved to complete their takeover. In 1973, the Nixon administration attempted to broker a ceasefire between the warring sides, but Pol Pot and his allies rejected any negotiations. Their belief in total victory was unshakable. Compromise was never part of their vision. By early 1975, the Khmer Rouge had surrounded Phnom. Supplies were dwindling, the capital was under siege. Daily life collapsed under the weight of war and famine. On the 17th of April 1975, Phnom Penh fell. Khmer Rouge forces entered the city to little resistance. Lon Nol had fled the country days earlier. The war was over, but what followed was unlike anything Cambodia or the world had seen before. Within hours of seizing power, the Khmer Rouge began evacuating the city's entire population. Over 2 million people, elderly, children, hospital patients, students, were forced to leave their homes and march into the countryside. The rationale given was that the Americans were preparing to bomb the city. In truth, the evacuation was part of Pol Pot's plan to eradicate urban life and begin immediate collectivization. This moment marked the beginning of one of the most radical and devastating revolutions in modern history. Phnom Penh became a ghost city. Hospitals were emptied, schools shuttered, homes abandoned. Those who resisted evacuation were executed. The sick and infirm were left to die on the roadside. In the name of revolution, Cambodia had begun a forced transformation, one in which modern society would be uprooted in its entirety. Pol Pot, now undisputed ruler of Cambodia, had achieved the first part of his vision, but the years to come would be defined by unprecedented brutality.
Year 0. Life and Death under the Khmer Rouge, 1975-1977. On the 17th of April 1975, as dawn broke over a battered Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge regime began its radical reordering of Cambodian society. Cities emptied, hospitals cleared, schools shuttered, markets and banks closed. In just days, the ancient rhythms of Cambodia's urban life were erased. Pol Pot and the Communist Party of Kampuchea named this moment Year 0, a symbolic beginning. A clean slate. All history before this point was deemed irrelevant. Across Phnom Penh and every other city under their control, Khmer Rouge cadres ordered residents to evacuate immediately. The justification was that American bombing was imminent, but the true reason ran deeper. Pol Pot and his inner circle viewed cities as corrupt, decadent, and infected with foreign influence. Urban populations were to be dismantled, and the people purified through forced labor. For over 2 million people, this marked the beginning of a harrowing journey. They were forced to march into the countryside, often with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. The young and elderly, the sick and wounded, no one was spared. Many died on the road, others collapsed from exhaustion or starvation. Children were separated from their parents. The sick were left behind. The dead were buried shallowly in rice fields, or not at all. This mass evacuation was not temporary. There were no plans for the displaced to return. Their homes were sealed, looted, or abandoned. Hospitals ceased to function. Currency was abolished. Religious buildings were converted into storage facilities, prisons, or simply destroyed. The new rulers of Cambodia had embarked on a complete deconstruction of society. Pol Pot's vision for the democratic Kampuchea was rooted in a radical ideology. The state would be entirely agrarian, without cities, markets, religion, or intellectualism. Society would be classless, structured into communal labor units known as cooperatives. Property was outlawed, families were dissolved, loyalty to the state came before all else. These cooperatives operated as forced labor camps. Cambodians were grouped into collectives of hundreds, or even thousands, and made to work from sunrise to sundown, constructing dams, digging canals, planting rice or building roads. Days began before dawn and ended long after nightfall. Meals consisted of thin porridge, sometimes flavored only with salt. Workers were watched by armed guards and expected to meet impossible quotas. Punishments for falling short included beatings, imprisonment, or execution. Conditions rapidly deteriorated. Malnutrition became widespread. Illnesses such as malaria, dysentery, and infections went untreated. With doctors executed and medicine scarce, preventable conditions became fatal. By late 1976, hundreds of thousands had perished from starvation and disease alone. But the Khmer Rouge's violence was not limited to neglect. Across Cambodia, execution sites began to appear. They were quiet fields, palm-fringed clearings, or forested riverbanks, now known as killing fields. Here, Pol Pot's regime carried out systematic purges aimed at eliminating perceived threat. Among the targets were former officials, police officers, military personnel, intellectuals, religious leaders, ethnic minorities, and anyone suspected of dissent. Even those wearing glasses or speaking a foreign language were considered suspect. Many were taken at night, often under false pretenses of reassignment or interrogation, and never returned. At the heart of the regime's machinery of terror stood Tuol Sleng, known as S-21, a former school-turned-prison in Phnom Penh. From the outside it looked like any quiet building. Inside it became the epicenter of horror. Thousands passed through S-21. Nearly all were tortured. Almost none survived. Interrogators extracted confessions through electric shocks, waterboarding, beatings, and psychological torment. Under duress, prisoners confessed to imaginary crimes, being CIA spies, Vietnamese agents or saboteurs. Once they had signed confessions, they were transported to execution sites, blindfolded, shackled and killed. Few were shot. Bullets were costly. Instead, sharpened bamboo, farming tools or clubs were used. Children were not spared. The regime's violence was ideological. It was not only political dissenters or supposed spies who were targeted. The Khmer Rouge had declared war on class, culture and religion itself. Monks were defrocked, temples demolished, books were burned, traditional arts banned, foreign languages outlawed. Entire populations were reclassified. The regime divided Cambodians into old people, those who had lived in liberated zones before 1975, and new people, those evacuated from the cities. The new people were treated with suspicion, given the hardest labor and the least food. They bore the brunt of the regime's cruelty. Even within the Khmer Rouge, purges became common. Pol Pot had grown increasingly paranoid. Trusted officials were accused of betrayal. In 1976, the regime purged several high-ranking members, including those who had once fought alongside him in the jungle. Nguyen Chia, Ieng Sari, and Khieu Phan remained close, but others were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Pol Pot's consolidation of power was now complete. That same year, in January 1976, the country was officially renamed Democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot became prime minister. His government operated in secrecy. Foreign observers were expelled. Diplomats were sent home. The regime now ruled in near total isolation. Throughout 1976 and 1977, life across the country became increasingly difficult. Food shortages worsened. The pace of labor intensified. Family units continued to be broken apart. Children were raised by the state. Marriages were arranged by local committees. Traditional customs were outlawed. Yet few outside Cambodia knew the full extent of the horrors taking place. Foreign governments remained cautious. The Khmer Rouge had limited relations with a handful of states, most notably China, The West, still wary of the aftermath of Vietnam and Cold War dynamics, paid little attention. Within the country, an atmosphere of fear and silence prevailed. People disappeared. Bodies surfaced in fields. Villages emptied overnight. No one spoke. No one questioned. There was only work and survival. By late 1977, the toll was unimaginable. As many as 1 million Cambodians were already dead. Starvation, overwork, disease, and execution were claiming tens of thousands each month, and the purges were only intensifying. Yet within the central command of Democratic Kampuchea, Pol Pot remained unwavering. He believed the revolution was succeeding. The forced agrarian transformation, he insisted, was a necessary stage of development. Suffering was part of the purification process. What he did not foresee was that Cambodia's greatest external threat would soon come not from within, but from its eastern neighbor. As 1977 drew to a close, relations with Vietnam deteriorated. Skirmishes broke out along the border. Pol Pot began to speak of a coming war, and for the people of Cambodia, those who had survived forced labor, starvation, and the killing fields, the worst was still to come. War with Vietnam and the fall of the Khmer Rouge, 1977–1979. By late 1977, Pol Pot's Democratic Kampuchea was under siege, not just from internal dissent, but from its powerful neighbor to the east. The Khmer Rouge, already embroiled in their radical reordering of Cambodian society, had now set the stage for a conflict that would end their brutal reign. The war began as a result of escalating tensions between Cambodia and Vietnam over border disputes and territorial claim. Pol Pot's regime, which had aligned itself with China and rejected the influence of Vietnam and the Soviet Union, now found itself clashing with its neighbors' growing influence in the region. The Khmer Rouge had long seen the Vietnamese as a threat, not only due to their military power but also because of their communist ideology, which Pol Pot viewed as impure compared to his own vision for Cambodia. Under the Khmer Rouge's xenophobic, nationalistic ideology, the Vietnamese were portrayed as an enemy who sought to dominate the region. Tensions first flared in 1975, when Pol Pot's regime began targeting ethnic Vietnamese living within Cambodia, forcing them into labor camps or executing them on suspicion of espionage. This act of aggression, coupled with the Khmer Rouge's continued border encroachments, aggravated the situation. But it wasn't just ethnic issues that caused conflict. It was also a matter of territorial control. The Khmer Rouge had repeatedly launched attacks along the Vietnamese-Cambodian border, hoping to claim land that had long been under Vietnamese control. The first major confrontation between Cambodia and Vietnam came in 1977, when the Khmer Rouge launched a series of border incursions into Vietnam's southwestern provinces. The Vietnamese responded with a series of counterattacks, which set off a cycle of escalating violence. Vietnamese soldiers raided Cambodian villages along the border, burning homes and executing suspected Khmer Rouge sympathizers. The Khmer Rouge, determined to defend their revolution, retaliated with their own brutal purges, particularly targeting those they viewed as collaborators or Vietnamese spies. Despite the growing violence, Pol Pot and his inner circle refused to back down. Instead, they reinforced the idea that Vietnam posed an existential threat to Cambodian sovereignty. This rhetoric only fueled the conflict. The conflict was marked by a brutal style of warfare. The Khmer Rouge did not engage in conventional military tactics. Instead, they favored guerrilla warfare and used civilian populations as shields, forcing them to fight and build fortifications. Casualties mounted, both from direct combat and from the brutal conditions of the conflict. By late 1978, the Cambodian-Vietnamese border region had become a war zone. Thousands of Cambodians, including ethnic Khmer, were caught in the crossfire, subject to forced conscription and relentless attacks. Entire villages were wiped out, and more Cambodians died as a result of the conflict than at any point during Pol Pot's regime up to that time. While the Khmer Rouge focused on expansion through violent purges and territorial gains, the Vietnamese had already begun massing a military response. Vietnam's leaders, especially General Vo Nguyen Giap, were not willing to allow their country to be destabilized by Cambodia's aggressive actions. In December 1978, Vietnam had had enough. The Vietnamese military, with over 100,000 troops,
launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. This would mark the beginning of the end for the Khmer Rouge. The Vietnamese army quickly crossed the border into Cambodia, targeting key Khmer Rouge positions. Using their knowledge of Cambodian terrain, which was far more familiar than the Khmer Rouge's, the Vietnamese forces were able to advance swiftly, pushing the Khmer Rouge back across much of the country. Pol Pot's forces, already depleted from years of warfare and internal purges, could not stand against the onslaught. By January 7, 1979, the Vietnamese army had reached Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, and seized the city with little resistance. Pol Pot, along with his senior officers, fled Phnom Penh in a desperate retreat, leaving the city to the Vietnamese invaders. It was a humiliating moment for a regime that had once promised to protect Cambodia from foreign influence. But despite the collapse of their leadership in the capital, the Khmer Rouge refused to accept defeat. Pol Pot and the remaining members of his inner circle retreated into the jungles of Cambodia, where they would continue to wage guerrilla warfare for years to come. However, the Vietnamese were not content simply with taking Phnom Penh. Their forces established a new government in the capital, the People's Republic of Kampuchea, headed by Cambodian exiles who had fled the Khmer Rouge's terror. They quickly declared the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, but Pol Pot and his followers had not been fully defeated. While Vietnam consolidated its control over Cambodia's urban areas, pockets of resistance remained in the countryside. These resistance forces were primarily composed of Khmer Rouge militants, who had scattered following the fall of Phnom Penh. From 1979 onward, Cambodia found itself in a new phase of conflict, a prolonged civil war between Vietnam-backed forces and the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge, despite their apparent military failure, were far from finished. In the border regions, they managed to regroup and continue fighting, supported by China and the United States, both of whom feared the growing influence of Vietnam in the region. As the 1980s wore on, Pol Pot's leadership over the Khmer Rouge began to weaken. His health deteriorated, and internal conflicts within the party further eroded his control. Yet despite these setbacks, Pol Pot and his faction continued to lead a bitter resistance against the Vietnamese-backed government. The war dragged on, as did the Khmer Rouge's violent campaign against the new Cambodian regime. Despite the ongoing warfare, by the late 1980s, it became clear that Pol Pot's influence over the Khmer Rouge was waning. The Khmer Rouge's new leader, Khieu Samphan, began to take more prominence in the leadership, and Pol Pot withdrew from the public eye. He remained, however, an important symbol for the Khmer Rouge's resistance, though his role became increasingly ceremonial. In the final years of the 1980s, the Khmer Rouge were a shadow of their former selves, unable to maintain the widespread terror they had once imposed. As Cambodia's internal situation began to stabilize, the Vietnamese troops withdrew from the country, leaving the Khmer Rouge and other factions to fight among themselves. Pol Pot, despite his waning influence, continued to lead the Khmer Rouge, but his hold on power was slipping. The final painful chapter of his regime was written in the ashes of his fallen empire. By the time the Khmer Rouge were finally defeated, over 1 million Cambodians had died at their hands. The country had been decimated, and the scars of Pol Pot's regime would last for generations. The end of Pol Pot and the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge, 1979, following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1979 and the fall of Phnom Penh, the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot were driven from power, but their reign of terror left deep scars on the country. What followed was a decade of chaos, as Cambodia's internal conflict dragged on through the 1980s, until the eventual collapse of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot, once the absolute ruler of Cambodia, now faced the harsh reality of his own demise. By January 1979, with Phnom Penh firmly in the hands of the Vietnamese-backed government, Pol Pot and his remaining loyalists fled into the jungles of Cambodia's remote border regions, primarily in the north. There, the remnants of the Khmer Rouge would continue their resistance against the new government, but their strength was greatly diminished. Despite the fall of their regime, Pol Pot's followers, largely guerrilla fighters and die-hard supporters, did not surrender easily. They established bases along the Thai-Cambodian border, where they received limited support from external actors, most notably from China, who remained sympathetic to their cause due to its anti-Vietnam stance, and from the United States, which continued to see the Khmer Rouge as a potential counterbalance to Vietnam's growing influence in Southeast Asia. As the 1980s unfolded, Pol Pot's leadership began to wane. The Khmer Rouge were no longer the powerful force they had once been. Factionalism and infighting began to take their toll. Internal rivalries, poor health, and mounting pressure from both the Cambodian government and the international community gradually eroded Pol Pot's grip on power. Internally, the Khmer Rouge were splintered. The loss of their stronghold in Phnom Penh left Pol Pot without the means to assert control over the fragmented party. By the mid-1980s, Pol Pot's declining health became increasingly apparent. He was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of cancer that left him weakened and unable to command the same level of authority he once had. His health worsened throughout the decade, contributing to his retreat from the public eye. Despite his declining health, Pol Pot's desire for power remained undiminished. He continued to lead the Khmer Rouge from the shadows, focusing primarily on maintaining his influence over the few remaining fighters still loyal to him. However, the Khmer Rouge was no longer the monolithic movement it had been in the 90s. A series of defeats in the late 1980s pushed them closer to irrelevance. In 1989, Vietnam, which had occupied Cambodia for a decade, began to withdraw its troops, leaving the government in Phnom Penh vulnerable to the ongoing guerrilla campaigns. The Khmer Rouge, though weakened, attempted to regroup and rally more support, but the party's leadership was fractured, and their cause was no longer seen as the heroic struggle for Cambodia's future, but rather as a failed, brutal movement clinging to past ideology. In the years following Vietnam's withdrawal, the Cambodian government, now led by Hun Sen, turned its attention to the Khmer Rouge remnants. Through a mix of military operations and diplomatic efforts, the Cambodian government sought to neutralize Pol Pot's forces, but this was a lengthy process. The Khmer Rouge held out in the border region for several more years, engaging in sporadic skirmishes and continuing their resistance against the government. Throughout this period, Pol Pot's health continued to decline. His once sharp mind became clouded, and he suffered from both physical and mental deterioration. His former comrades began to distance themselves from him as his authority weakened. Despite his failing health, Pol Pot remained a symbol of resistance for a small faction of Khmer Rouge militants, who believed in his vision of a pure agrarian Cambodia. In 1997, after years of continued infighting and internal purges within the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot's fate took a dramatic turn. His own comrades, led by a former ally named Ta Mok, turned against him. On the eve of the Khmer Rouge's total collapse, Ta Mok and his faction placed Pol Pot under house arrest, accusing him of betrayal, and seeking to distance themselves from his legacy of terror. Pol Pot, who had once been the unchallenged ruler of Cambodia, now found himself a prisoner of his own party. His health had deteriorated so badly that he was barely able to move or speak. He had been abandoned by the very movement he had founded. The Khmer Rouge was falling apart, and Pol Pot was at its center, an increasingly irrelevant figure in the face of the country's ongoing recovery and the collapse of his regime. In July 1997, a Khmer Rouge trial was held in a makeshift court to judge Pol Pot for his role in the genocide and the crimes against humanity committed during his regime. This trial was symbolic, an attempt by the party to hold him accountable for the horrors he had inflicted on Cambodia. The trial was a mockery of justice, lacking any real legal procedures or international oversight, and was more an expression of internal factional struggles than a genuine attempt at reconciliation. But Pol Pot would never see the consequences of his actions in a true court of law. On the night of April 15, 1998, as he languished under house arrest, Pol Pot died in his sleep. The official cause of death was a heart attack, though many have speculated that he may have taken his own life to avoid being handed over to the international community for trial. Regardless of the circumstances, Pol Pot's death marked the final chapter in the life of one of the 20th century's most notorious figures. 6 days after his death, Pol Pot was cremated in a Buddhist ceremony. His passing was marked by little public mourning. The man who had caused so much suffering, both in Cambodia and the world, was gone, but his legacy of violence, oppression and genocide would haunt Cambodia for generations to come. In the years following Pol Pot's death, the Cambodian government worked tirelessly to heal the country's wound. The Khmer Rouge was disbanded, and many of its former members were brought to trial for their crimes. But for the victims of Pol Pot's regime, no trial or tribunal could fully account for the destruction of their lives. Cambodia today remains deeply scarred by the legacy of the Khmer Rouge. Over 1.7 million people perished under Pol Pot's regime, nearly 1/4 of the country's population. The killing fields, where countless victims were executed, and the torture centers, where people were subjected to unimaginable horrors, stand as grim reminders of the atrocity. Though Pol Pot's death in 1998 brought an end to the Khmer Rouge as an active political force, the country's healing process is ongoing. The wounds of the past are still felt, and the people of Cambodia continue to rebuild, seeking justice, reconciliation, and a brighter future. As Cambodia continues its journey towards recovery, the legacy of Pol Pot remains a powerful reminder of the destructive potential of totalitarian ideologies and the lasting impact of human suffering.